everybody. Welcome, dear Minister Dohnanyi.
And welcome to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, there is rain outside and sometimes it's sun. The weather is sunny, sometimes it's raining. So we decided to have a secure line to you, to Hamburg, that we organize this event here in the mayor's office, here in the town hall. But outside on the screens, there is a big audience also who is watching us. So thank you very much.
But they are watching in the rain.
Now it's sun, but 10 minutes ago there was a huge rain. So it's a very, very changing weather. It's not best for a festival, but I think this program and this discussion is interesting for everybody. And your book, which is here in my hand, is a huge success in Hungary. It's read by a big audience, and in the press there are big discussions about your book. So we are very pleased and very thankful that you could join us to MCC Fesztre. Mr. Dohnanyi was born 1928 and is a member of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, since 1957. He was a leading politician in the former governments of the German Chancellors Brandt and Schmidt in the role of Minister for Education and Science and respectively State Minister in the Foreign Ministry. Later he became a very successful mayor of the Free Hanseatic city of Hamburg, and he is the successful author of countless books. With his newest publication that I already introduced, he has a huge success in Berlin and in Germany. When I was some weeks ago at the new Berlin airport, there was in the bookshop a huge package of your book, and it shows already how well received it. And in Hungary, it is, as I already described, very successful. The topic of the book is the European position in between the world hegemons of China, Russia, and the United States. Mr. Dohnanyi shows how the light of our history, many different and single European interests emerge. He encourages the Europeans, the Germans as well, to stand up for their national interests. Again, and not just blindly follow naive idea of community of values and friendships, so they can find a common ground for politics once again. I would also ask the audience that there is a Slido code that you can see on the screen. The Slido code is #1545736, and there will be a chance to ask questions from Mr. Dohnanyi. My first question would be that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholtz recently said Germany has to come back to its national interests and define what we stand for. Mr. Dohnanyi, if Scholz says that, did Germany until now not defend its national interests? How does Scholz get to this statement? What's changed in Germany? And are national interests a taboo in Germany? What is your opinion about this?
I think the German interest is, of course, a European interest, and it is at the same time also in part the Hungarian interest. We are all Europeans, and as Europeans we have, of course, also a common interest. But within the European community, every nation has her own national interest. And that you can see, for example, if you look at the situation between France and Germany in the situation of energy, France insisted that nuclear energy should be part of the taxonomy in the sort of the federal, that it can be enhanced by public money. It is sort of a part of the energy that can also be looked at as an energy that is forward-looking. And Germany was of very different opinions, and we voted against the Commission in that part, and France voted for it. So you can have a common interest, and that is that the entire situation which is connected with the changing of climate is a common interest. But we approach the climate problem on different roads. And that applies also, as I can see, for Hungary, which is also exposing again or opening again to more nuclear energy. And that is one way of doing it. And therefore, we have national interests within a community that has common interests. And that to understand is very important, and that to understand in connection also with the interests of the United States, of Russia, of China, is also of importance. In other words, national interests are not going down because we have an integrated world. Within that integrated world, there will be a lot of national interests today and tomorrow.
In your book, you argue for the same, that we have to rediscover and we need a recovery of our European national interests, in plural. What are these interests? How do you see which fields and which industries and which security issues are the most important for Europe?
As far as industry is concerned, that of course is very different. I mean, France and Spain and Germany have different industrial structures, and Hungary has also. But we have a common interest, and that is to be effective, competitive, and successful in our economic development. And it's very important to reconsider that in view of the development of the Commission and of the policy that the Commission is following. Because if you put too much strain, too much commonality, too much equalization on the various kinds of different economies, Germany or Italy or Greece or France or whatever, then these countries cannot develop their real successful possibilities. I think it's very important to recognize that Europe has had its great international success in the past on diversity and not on sort of equality in every areas. And we have to see that the Commission does not overdo the commonality in European interests, but look that the individual interests of the nations is being preserved. And therefore, I would also look at the event of the Brexit. The Brexit was one example for an overstretching the commonality in Europe. I think it's not only Johnson's policy has been not only Johnson's policy, it has also been the policy of the continental Europeans who wanted too much commonality, and therefore Britain split up. And that, I think, was a great mistake.
What do you think, what is the future of Europe? There is a big discussion now, and I think this discussion is going on since about 1 or even 2 decades. And the question that is always asked, what kind of Europe do we need? Do we need a federalistic Europe? Do we need a Europe with a United States of Europe? Or do we need a Europe of nation states? What is your opinion about this?
I think the alternative is not that strict as you put it. We need commonality in certain areas, no question about it, in particular, since within the Eurozone, for example, we have the need for a common, plain situation so that we don't have to compete under very different conditions within the same monetary union. But on the other hand, you must see that you will never be able to have a fully common interest in a set of nations, now 27 nations, with a very different histories, with 24 different languages. And it is perfectly impossible to make this into the states of, like the United States of America, the United States of Europe. That will not work. And therefore, what we need is a strategy of common purpose and of common action in areas which are necessary to be commonly approached. But what we don't need is that everything is equalized and commonalized and put into the same situation. That is not possible.
What do you think, what is this common interest of Europe if we look in the war of Ukraine?
I think the interest is to stop the war. That is the common interest. The common interest is to stop the war. The war, which claims to defend the Ukraine, does not really defend the interests of the Ukraine. The Ukraine is being destroyed by a war which Russia started, no question about it. But our interest, of course, is to preserve a Ukraine which later on can well cooperate with Europe. And therefore, our interest must be both to put the Ukraine into a position where the Ukraine can defend herself, but at the same time to urge the Ukraine to end the war with negotiations with Russia. And I think that that is possible, but I'm not sure that this is in the interest of the United States. And therefore, we must now in our discussion, I think, also look at the various interests between the great world powers. There is a difference of interest in the security question exactly there between, for example, the United States and Europe, whereas, of course, we are put together or we live together in one defense organization like NATO. But the interests, how we should defend that, in that security, this interest is very different.
And what do you think? Why is this interest of the United States so different? Of course, it's a different continent, but don't they want to end the war? Or what is your opinion about this?
Well, the United States is about 6,000 kilometers away from Europe. It is away by and secured by an ocean that is about 6,000 kilometers away from the European shores. And therefore, the United States has not experienced a war on her own territory, attacked by a foreign power, I think since 1812, since more than 200 years. America is geopolitically a very safe country and very privileged by its geopolitical situation, whereas Europe has, of course, the direct neighborhood with Russia and the direct neighborhood also with the Near East, etc. So we must see that the interests are very different. The interest for Europe is not to be hurt by attacks. America could take the attacks in Europe and would not be attacked herself directly. So therefore, we must see that our interest in Europe is much more closely related to the security of the European situation than the interests of the United States.
Nowadays, we see, even in connection with the war, but probably previously there were warning signs already, that Europe is going towards a political, economic, and social crisis, which we haven't seen since the Cold War. Is this the price we must pay now for our past mistakes, or should we look at the situation as a result of the global trends?
I cannot see the mistakes in the past. I think Hungary, for example, has contributed significantly to the fall of the wall, to the opening of Europe. Then Germany has contributed by the people of Eastern Germany really tearing down the wall. That was not a mistake. But we have not understood that the Cold War also had stability structures. And we have not looked after 1990 how we should restructure the stability structures of Europe. The Cold War rested on suppression of the East, on freedom, development in the West. And Hungary knows that better than probably any other country in the world. But now, when the wall fell and when freedom was achieved, the safety structures of the Cold War collapsed. And therefore, it would have been our job after 1990, after the fall of the wall, after the opening to the East, after the falling apart of the Soviet Union, to create a new structure of peace and of security. And we have not done that. In fact, we have, instead of doing that, We have tried to expose Russia to an extension of NATO. And all intelligent people I know of, from Kissinger to others, have always said it is a certain danger in this expansion of NATO. And today's head of the CIA, of the American intelligence services under Biden, who wrote a book in 2019 and saying that this extension of the NATO was a grave mistake and could be understood by Russia as a threat. And of course NATO is not an aggressive organization. Of course not. And of course NATO would never start a war against Russia. But safety and security is also a question of perception. And the Russian people, not only Putin, the majority of the Russian people have understood this extension of NATO as a real danger. And of course it is understandable, in particular with the problem of the Ukraine, that Russia did not want to have American Marines patrol on the Russian border. And that was the real issue. And therefore, I would say we must consider the interests of nations by putting ourselves in the shoes of the other side. It is not nice, not intelligent to only say what we think is safe. We must also look what others with whom we live, like Russia and China, thinks that is safe. And that will be a big issue now also between the United States and China in the future, and that might also become dangerous for Europe.
But how can we reach this situation? Because I think what you describe is perfectly correct, but Europe on his own has not an army that is capable to defend itself. We need the United States for our own defense. On the other hand, what you suggest is that we try to keep our European interests, our national interests within Europe. How to bring these two things together? Because to build a strong army is not to do within 1 or 2 years.
You gave the answer yourself. Europe will not be able to defend herself, never, I don't think, in the future, against a world and highly nuclear-powered country like Russia, if Russia remains aggressive against the West. But I don't think that Russia is generally aggressive against the West and has not been. And many studies that you can read have shown that even during the Cold War, Russia had never the intention to attack the West. So what is our alternative? Our alternative is, of course, to be able to defend ourselves, no question about it. And therefore, it is also important that Germany puts more money into defense than in the past. I don't deny that. But the major strategy for European security is cooperation with Russia, to create an interest in Russia that no aggression between West and East is important or good or profitable for Russia. And that we have not done, and that we must do. It must be clear that we have to deal with Russia on an equal basis. And the United States is so far away and has so different security interests and will not suffer if a war in Europe is expanding into the European area, I mean beyond the Ukraine, that we should intervene in the questions with negotiations, but also with monetary and economic cooperation. That is an important element. And now we have, of course, a discussion that the German policy of changing by trade was a mistake. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was the only strategy that was possible. The mistake was to expand the military structure of Europe, of the NATO, into the Russian interest area, into the Ukraine and Georgia. And that was the mistake. And the mistake was not to trade in gas or oil or other raw materials or other technology areas. It was, in fact, it was much more profitable for Europe and for Russia to work together than to fight together.
In Hungary, the discussion, if you switch on the news, the everyday discussions are going about the energy. will we have enough oil? Will we have enough gas? In Hungary, we have a situation that more than 80% of our gas is coming from Russia. More than 60% of our oil is coming from Russia. In Germany, the situation is not as radical, but very similar. How do you see this situation, and what do you foresee for the winter?
I think it would be wise to run this dependency down to a certain amount, but not by saying that we don't your gas, not at all, not by saying that we don't take your oil anymore. But of course, if you have one supplier, and that is also true in any business, if a business has for essential parts of its production only one supplier, it becomes dependent on this one supplier. We had the situation, for example, with Volkswagen for a couple of years ago, with some supplier, I think from Croatia or from Serbia, I don't know, I don't recall exactly. But suddenly they could sort of press Volkswagen into a certain action. That should not occur. So diversity in energy supply is a good idea. But to disrupt the energy supply totally and to disrupt the connection with Russia on economic, in the area of trade, etc., and of culture is a major mistake. You will never get Russia off the geographic chart. It is there. Russia is there, it's a big country, and it is our neighbor, and therefore it is important to trade, to have cultural contacts with Russia. And what the present policy of the West is dictated by American interests. And I am a friend of America and not an anti-Americanist, that I would never be. But I can see that the interests are different. America has no interest in a strong Europe and not interest in a strong Russia, but it has only interest in a strong America. And we must see how can we get a strong Europe? And we cannot get it if we fight with Russia. That is simply a mistake. And therefore, my policy and what I wrote in my book is, and therefore I think the book is much more interesting from point of view of the need to look at your own interest and to share and to compare your interest with your competitive friends, than to sort of become anti-American or anti-Russian. That's a big mistake, and therefore I'm grateful that the book has been translated into Hungarian.
I was grown up and had my schooling in a time when the theory of Francis Fukuyama, End of History, was basically the most important book in the 90s and in the 2000s. As what you describe now is completely the opposite of that. How do you see the global processes, Europe, China, and the United States, and of course Russia? Because I think probably the situation that we have in the Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, is strongly connected with the relations between China and the United States, and to this policy that all these conflicts will be swept away, and then now, probably for the average people, from one day to the other, they appear again. How does it come?
Well, I think national interests are being seen more clearly if you have difficult times and a breakdown of past structures. And that is, of course, what I described before, what happened when the Cold War ended, the wall fell, and the freedom came back into Eastern Europe and into Hungary, etc. So the structures of security changed or fell away. I mean, that everybody knows. So what will be the future? The future, I think, will be an attempt to understand that nations have different interests but must cooperate and also must be in a position to compromise. It is national interest is not nationalistic interest. National interest means look at your own and the interests of your neighbor, and then see to it how you can jibe the two, how you can get the two together. That is the job. and that takes diplomacy and not guns. And the idea that international safety can be created by guns has been really shown as an impossible idea. The Americans have tried it in the Near East, they have tried it in other areas, and it doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to try to understand what does this people that lives in different conditions, in a different area, with a different history, with a different culture, with different interests, how can we jibe our interest with theirs? That takes trade, that takes diplomacy, that takes cultural exchange, and then I think you can create slowly a maybe peaceful world. We never had a peaceful world, but that might have a chance.
What do you think, how Central European states can strengthen Europe? Because Hungary formulated different opinions in connection with the war on Russia, in connection with the Hungary always said that the war in Russia was started by Russia and the aggression is coming from Russia, and immediately the war must be stopped immediately. On the other hand, Hungary had a similar position towards the energy policy, that we can't cut the energy supply from one day to the other. How can we contribute to the common European interest, and how Central European states who are closer to Russia and the Ukraine can contribute to this European interest that you describe?
I think Hungary already contributes to the task which you have just described by taking her own position. And what Hungary should do maybe a bit better, that I have said many times, is to explain why. To explain why. And to give this position a sort of more stable intellectual ground. But there is no question, in my opinion, that we need a European debate whether a NATO led by America, led by a country that freed us from Nazism. Everybody knows that, and we are all thankful for that. But then they stayed in Europe and tried to sort of put Europe into what the geopolitical people in America called Europe is the bridgehead of American power on the Eurasian continent, the bridgehead on the Eurasian continent. That is what we are in the view of the United States, a bridgehead. And this bridgehead has an interest of remaining and existing and remaining free and safe. And our safety is something different than the American security. And therefore, I think what Hungary does is try to explain that there are different views. And if I wish we had in Germany a debate. I wrote this book in German only to initiate a debate. It hasn't happened. We have a monochrome media. There is practically no debate on this topic. I have a lot of people writing to me how right you are, but this doesn't take place in Berlin and not within the Berlin government. And that I regret, and maybe Viktor Orban could initiate within the Berlin parties a debate. That life is not that clear and that we should debate. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not saying that I'm always right. I'm saying that this is a perspective which we should look at. And therefore, I think it is worthwhile that the Hungarian position is being explained within Europe and clearly explained within Europe.
What do you mean by a monochrome media, or what do you mean by, because from Hungary, Germany was always an example for us. How do you see that?
Germany is presently not an example in public debate. We have no public debate about the alternatives in our safe security structure. We follow the American path. Chancellor Olaf Scholtz tries to do that by again and again trying to talk to Putin. But when he talks to Putin, immediately some of the Baltic nations, etc., you shouldn't even talk. And how can you ever create a peaceful situation in any area without talking to your neighbor? It is not possible. And therefore, I think Germany is presently not an example of political culture. We are too monochrome. The media, we have no real opposition in only a right-wing, small right-wing opposition in the German Bundestag. And I think we are not a good example presently. There is even more dispute, more discussion, more debate about this issue in the United States than in Germany presently.
We received a lot of questions, Mr. Dohnanyi. I would read some of them. There are a lot of very interesting questions. Probably the first that is very important and a lot of people ask now in Europe. Is the world facing a new Cold War?
I'm sorry.
Is the world facing a new Cold War?
Yes, it is, I hope, only a new Cold War. It is in Ukraine a hot war. And the danger is that this hot war in the Ukraine could extend into other parts of Europe. So if we end in a Cold War, it's bad enough, but it's better than an expanding into a new hot war.
How can Europe make itself more independent from global actors?
Europe should, within NATO, and I'm not saying NATO should be dissolved, Europe should, within NATO, develop a common strategy, which I think will be very difficult because between the Baltic nations, for example, and France and Germany, it is very difficult to find a common ground. But if we can do that, then Europe should, at least within NATO, begin to discuss the question how a NATO strategy should be added. The NATO military strategy is only a military strategy. There is no real diplomatic strategy. And we should try to extend our tools of NATO in a very important diplomatic tools, because that is really the future of Europe.
Christoph is asking from you, what do you think about the sanctions against Russia? Is it a failure or a success? Will it provoke further aggression?
I have studied sanctions now for many, many years. Sanctions are, if you look into the past, for example, look at the sanctions against Iran, look at the sanctions in other, they don't have any effect. In Iran, it had an effect. It produced a more hardline president than we had before. And in China, it produced problems on this minority problem. It has another similar effect. No, I think sanctions are not very useful. And also what they do is they have maybe more effect on other people. I mean, Germany suffers from sanctions of the United States against Iran more than Iran, as it presently looks like. So I think that the sanctions probably are something I wrote in my book. They're basically for home consumption. As the Americans would say, they are useful to sort of satisfy the domestic election people, I mean the voters. Oh yeah, we do something, we now put Russia into a difficult situation. I don't think that this is really very effective. The ruble is today stronger than before, and Russia is selling the gas and the oil into other areas, and Russia is moving into autarky in areas where we had good relations with Russia. I doubt it. Now, on the other hand, I admit that what else can you do? When you don't want to use military means, which I hope we don't, then you must do something. And sanctions, of course, are something that you can do. I don't think they will be very effective. And presently, we have a very strange situation in Germany. immediately after Putin began his criminal war in the Ukraine. Afterwards, Mrs. Baerbock, our foreign minister, she said we should cut off all gas relations with Russia immediately. Today, we beg and hope that Russia is delivering gas in spite of this expressed intention. So we are put into a rather ridiculous situation, I think. Sanctions are at least a difficult tool, and I don't think they are very useful. And American studies show, by the way, the same effect.
Another question from the audience. Do you think the difference, both ideological and economical, between Eastern and Western Europe is an issue? If yes, how can we solve it?
Could you repeat this question again? Because
yes.
I've not quite understood what you want to hear.
Do you think the difference between Eastern and Western Europe is an issue? Is there a dividing line between Eastern and Western Europe in ideological, political, or economical way? Is this a real issue, or you don't think so? There is not a dividence between Eastern and Western Europe?
I wouldn't say that there is an ideological or a cultural difference, but there is a difference in experience. If you have been occupied by Russia for more than 40 years, you have, of course, a very different look at the world, at Russia today, than the West has. And therefore, I think this experience has to be respected by the West. We have the same problem, by the way, also in Germany. We have a difference in Germany in the outlook on Russia between West Germany and East Germany. So I think that it is very important to realize that we have to expect also within this European compound, within this European commonality, that we should look at the different interests that experience has produced. But therefore we should discuss, we should debate, we should not discredit, but there are differences, but they are not so different cultures or great cultural difference. That I don't believe. But the political differences are great, and they are sometimes also exploited by our American friends. As we know how Mr. Trump tried to move the Poles, etc. Poland took part into the war in Iraq, and I think it was Mr. Cheney or one of his people who said that there's a new Europe, and that is the Eastern Europe, and an old Europe, sort of, and we are in the West, we are sort of old people, and which I am, of course, and in the East, they are the new people. This, I think, was not very helpful on the American side.
My last question would be my own question. Everybody knows you in Hungary, and we are very proud that, and we know that you have a Hungarian heritage. How do you see this Hungarian heritage of yourself, and what would be the message for the Hungarian people?
It is very difficult for me to describe my Hungarian heritage because I don't speak the language. I have been there only occasionally, and yet I feel that it's part of my home. And I don't know how I can explain that. And I have no way of understanding it. There must be something strange. There is a sort of biological story of fishes who return over long ways to go back to the areas where they were born. And why that? And so I have a strange relationship to Hungary and a feeling of nearness which amazes myself. And my message would be for both of us to try, for the Germans and the Hungarians, to bridge over the differences that have accrued in the past. They make me very, how shall I say, I feel with sorrow about this development because in particular, before the wall fell, people, Viktor Orban, for example, was one of the very early people who said Russia should disappear. And then your government opened the wall by cutting down the fence. I was very proud of Hungary at that time. I was also very proud of Hungary's fight in 1956. So I don't know what makes my nearness to Hungary. I haven't been there much. My grandfather left when my father was still very young, and I recall, of course, I've written that in my book. My father was grew up then as a German, more or less, and my grandmother still had this wonderful Hungarian accent, which I love. So my greetings go to Hungary, and my love goes to Hungary. I don't know really why.
Mr. Dohnanyi, we hope that one day we can meet you in person here in Hungary. Until that, we have your fantastic book that will probably bring more closer Germany and Hungary. Thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you very much for your time und viele Grüße nach Hamburg.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to talk to you and to listen to your questions and to try to be able to answer these questions. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure for me.
Thank you.